Imagine for a moment a land of immense wealth, a true jewel of the Mughal Empire. This was Bengal in the early 18th century. Its rivers, like the Ganges and Brahmaputra, made the soil incredibly fertile. Farmers grew rice, weavers created the finest silks and cottons, and merchants traded these goods across the world. Bengal was actually known as the paradise of nations for its riches. It was ruled by a Nawab, a governor who, while technically under the Mughal emperor in Delhi, acted with almost complete independence. The capital, Murshidabad, was a bustling city, said to be as prosperous as London at the time. This was really a land of opportunity, drawing traders from far and wide, including from Europe. Among these European traders was the British East India Company. At first, they were just one group among many, including the French, Dutch, and Portuguese. They came to trade, not to rule. They built fortified trading posts, called factories, in places like Calcutta. For many years, they operated under the permission of the local Nawab, paying taxes and following the rules. Their main business was buying local goods, especially textiles, and selling them for a huge profit back in Europe. This relationship, while sometimes tense, was mostly peaceful and profitable for both sides. The company was a guest in a powerful land, and they knew it. But, things were starting to change, both in India and in Britain. The Mughal Empire, the great power that had dominated India for centuries, was weakening. Its emperors were losing control over their vast territories, and powerful regional rulers like the Nawab of Bengal were becoming more independent. At the same time, the East India Company was growing more ambitious. It wasn't just a trading firm anymore. It had its own private army, raised to protect its interests. In Britain, the Industrial Revolution was beginning, creating a huge demand for raw materials and new markets for finished goods. The company saw Bengal not just as a place to trade, but as a prize to be won. This set the stage for a monumental clash. On one side was the ancient and wealthy Nawabate of Bengal, with its vast armies and deep-rooted traditions. On the other was the modern, aggressive, and well-organized British East India Company, backed by the growing power of the British Empire. The conflict that followed, known as the Anglo Bengal Wars, was not just a series of battles. It was a struggle for the soul of India. It would decide who would control the immense wealth of Bengal, and ultimately shape the future of the entire subcontinent for the next 200 years. The story of these wars is a story of ambition, betrayal, and the birth of an empire. The first major explosion of this simmering conflict came in 1756. The new Nawab of Bengal, a young and determined man named Siraj-ud-Dowlah, was watching the British with growing suspicion. He saw them strengthening the fortifications around their base at Fort William in Calcutta without his permission. He also accused them of abusing their trading privileges, known as dastaks, which allowed them to trade without paying taxes. This meant the Nawab's government was losing a huge amount of money. Siraj saw this as a direct challenge to his authority. He was the ruler of Bengal, and he would not tolerate a foreign trading company acting like they owned the place. He demanded they stop building and pay their taxes like everyone else. The British, feeling confident in their military strength, ignored the Nawab's warnings. This was, honestly, a grave miscalculation. Enraged by their defiance, Siraj-ud-Dowlah did what any sovereign ruler would do. He gathered his army and marched on Calcutta. His forces were vast, numbering around 50,000 soldiers, against a tiny garrison of a few hundred defenders inside Fort William. The British were completely unprepared for such a swift and powerful response. The siege was short and brutal. Outnumbered and outgunned, the British governor and senior officials panicked, abandoning the fort and its defenders by escaping on ships down the Hooghly River. After a brief but hopeless resistance, the remaining defenders, led by John Holwell, surrendered on June 20, 1756. What happened next became a major point of propaganda for the British. According to Holwell's account, the captured British prisoners were forced into a tiny dungeon within the fort, a room only about 18 by 14 feet. This small prison became infamously known as the Black Hole of Calcutta. In the stifling heat of a Bengali summer night, packed so tightly they could barely move, many suffocated. Holwell claimed that of the 146 people imprisoned, only 23 survived until morning. This event, whether exaggerated or not, was used by the British to paint Siraj-ud-Dowlah as a monstrous tyrant. The news of the fall of Calcutta and the story of the Black Hole sent shockwaves through the other British settlements in India. It was a humiliating defeat and a direct attack on British prestige and commercial interests. The East India Company's directors in Madras knew they could not let this stand. They needed to recapture Calcutta and punish the Nawab. This was no longer just about trading rights. It was about revenge and re-establishing British dominance. They assembled a powerful expeditionary force, a fleet of ships carrying professional soldiers, and placed it under the command of one of their most brilliant and ruthless officers, Lieutenant Colonel Robert Clive. The stage was now set for a full-scale war. Robert Clive arrived in Bengal with a clear mission: retake Calcutta and restore British authority. He quickly accomplished the first part, recapturing the city in January 1757 with little resistance. But Clive knew that simply taking back a fort was not enough. As long as Siraj-ud-Dowlah remained in power, the British position would never be secure. The Nawab still commanded a massive army far larger than anything Clive could muster. A direct, fair fight was a huge risk. So, Clive turned to a different kind of warfare conspiracy. He knew that the Nawab, being a young and assertive ruler, had made powerful enemies within his own court. Clive's plan was not to defeat Siraj's army on the battlefield, but to ensure it wouldn't fight at all. He secretly contacted the key figures who were unhappy with the Nawab's rule. The most important of these was Mir Jafar, Siraj-ud-Dowlah's commander-in-chief, and a powerful nobleman with ambitions of his own. Clive made a secret pact with him. The deal was simple during the upcoming battle. Mir Jafar would betray his master and refuse to fight with the bulk of the army. In return, the British would make him the new Nawab of Bengal. It was a treacherous plan, a gamble that relied entirely on betrayal. The fate of Bengal would be decided not by courage, but by conspiracy. The two armies met on June 23, 1757, on a mango grove near the village of Plassey. On paper, it was a complete mismatch. Siraj-ud-Dowlah had around 50,000 soldiers, including cavalry and war elephants supported by a contingent of French artillerymen. Robert Clive had a tiny force of about 3,000 men, a mix of British soldiers and Indian sepoys. The battle began with a cannonade. A sudden, heavy downpour of rain then soaked the battlefield, rendering the Nawab's gunpowder useless because his troops hadn't protected it properly. The British, however, had kept their powder dry. This was the moment Clive had been waiting for. As the British artillery began to fire effectively into the confused Bengali ranks, Clive ordered his infantry to advance. This was the critical moment for the conspirators. Mir Jafar, commanding a huge portion of the Nawab's army, stood still. He and his forces did nothing, simply watching from the sidelines as the small British force attacked. Seeing his main general's betrayal and his army in disarray, Siraj-ud-Dowlah lost his nerve. He fled the battlefield. With their leader gone and their commander-in-chief refusing to fight, the Nawab's army collapsed. The battle was over. It was less of a fight and more of a rout orchestrated by Clive's brilliant and cynical plan. The victory at Plassey made the East India Company the power behind the throne. They had installed their puppet, Mir Jafar, as the new Nawab. In return, he showered the company and its officials with money and land. Robert Clive himself became fabulously wealthy. However, the British soon found that Mir Jafar was not as easy to control as they had hoped. The company's demands for money were endless, and Mir Jafar's treasury was quickly emptied. He tried to assert some independence by making deals with the Dutch, but the British swiftly crushed them. Frustrated, the company deposed him and installed his son-in-law, Mir Qasim, as the new Nawab in 1760. Mir Qasim was a far more capable and determined ruler than his predecessor. He understood the threat the company posed and was determined to rebuild Bengal's strength and sovereignty. He moved his capital from Murshidabad, which was too close to British influence in Calcutta, to Munger in modern-day Bihar. There, he began to reform his army along European lines, hiring foreign mercenaries to train his soldiers. He also tried to fix the state's finances by cracking down on the widespread corruption of company officials who were avoiding taxes and ruining local merchants. This directly threatened the company's profits and power, and they would not stand for it. The conflict came to a head in 1764. Mir Qasim, having been driven out of Bengal by the British, formed a powerful alliance. He was joined by Shuja-ud-Dowlah, the powerful Nawab of Awadh, and even the Mughal emperor himself, Shah Alam II. This was no longer just a Bengali affair. It was a grand coalition of major Indian powers determined to drive the British out of eastern India. Their combined army was formidable, numbering over 40,000 men. They met the much smaller company army, commanded by Major Hector Munro, at the town of Buxar on October 22, 1764. Unlike Plassey, the Battle of Buxar was a real, hard-fought contest. There was no conspiracy, no betrayal. The Indian coalition fought with courage and skill and killed around 850 British soldiers in the battle. However, the East India Company's army proved to be superior in discipline, training, and technology. Munro's professional soldiers inflicted twice as many casualties as they received on the coalition army and killed around 2,000 of the Nawab's soldiers. The British soldiers used their bayonet guns and cannons to their advantage and ripped through the lines of the coalition army, whereas the British lines were more or less intact. By the end of the day, the British Army's superior firepower and command won a decisive victory. The Great Indian Alliance was shattered. This was the battle that truly sealed the fate of Bengal and in many ways all of India. It was a victory won not by treachery, but by military might. The victory at Buxar was a game-changer. It wasn't just a battle won. It was the moment the East India Company transitioned from a trading corporation to a ruling power. In 1765, the defeated Mughal Emperor Shah Alam II was forced to sign the Treaty of Allahabad. This treaty granted the company the Diwani of Bengal, Bihar, and Orissa. The Diwani was the right to collect taxes and revenues from these provinces. This was the ultimate prize. The company now controlled the finances of India's richest region. They could collect taxes from millions of people and use that money to fund their armies, their trade, and their administration. The Nawab was left as a powerless figurehead, a king with no kingdom. With the power of the Diwani, the company's sole focus became maximizing profit. The officials who were once traders now became tax collectors. Their methods were often brutal and unforgiving. They dramatically increased the land tax, demanding amounts that were often impossible for poor farmers to pay. They dismantled the traditional systems of governance and revenue collection that had been in place for centuries, replacing them with a system designed purely for extraction. The welfare of the Bengali people was not their concern. The wealth of Bengal was now being systematically drained away to fund the company's ambitions and enrich its shareholders in London. This ruthless exploitation had devastating consequences. In 1769, the monsoon rains failed, leading to a severe drought. Droughts were not uncommon in India, but in the past, local rulers had systems in place to deal with them, such as storing grain and providing tax relief. The company did the opposite. Not only did they fail to provide any relief, but they also aggressively collected taxes, in some cases even increasing them to make up for any shortfalls. Company merchants and their agents hoarded grain, buying it up cheap and selling it at astronomically high prices. The result was a catastrophe of unimaginable proportions. The Great Bengal Famine of 1770. The famine was a man-made disaster layered on top of a natural one. People starved to death in their homes and on the streets. Villages were abandoned as desperate people fled in search of food, only to die on the roads. It is estimated that around 10 million people, nearly a third of the population of Bengal at the time, perished from starvation and disease. The rich, fertile land of Bengal was turned into a desolate graveyard. The famine destroyed the region's traditional economy, wiped out a generation of skilled artisans and farmers, and left scars that would last for a century. It was a horrifying demonstration of what happened when a commercial enterprise with its own army took control of a state. The aftermath of the wars and the famine fundamentally and permanently altered the fabric of Bengali society. Before the company's rule, Bengal had a complex and sophisticated economy. It was a major global center for textile production, especially fine muslins and silks. Its weavers and artisans were renowned for their skill. This thriving industry was systematically dismantled. The British wanted Bengal to be a source of raw materials for their own factories in Britain and a market for their finished goods. They imposed high tariffs on Bengali textiles, making them uncompetitive, while flooding the market with cheap, machine-made cloth from Manchester. Skilled weavers were thrown out of work and forced into poverty. The land itself, the source of Bengal's wealth, was also transformed. In 1793, the company introduced the permanent settlement. This was a new system of land ownership that created a class of loyal landlords, known as zamindars, who were responsible for collecting taxes for the British. While this created a stable source of revenue for the company, it was disastrous for the peasants. They lost their traditional rights to the land they farmed and became tenants who could be evicted at any time. The tax rates were fixed at a very high level, and the zamindars often used ruthless methods to collect them, pushing millions of farmers into a cycle of debt and poverty from which they could never escape. The political landscape was also completely redrawn. The Nawab of Bengal, once a powerful and independent ruler, was reduced to a mere pensioner of the company, living on a stipend in his palace at Murshidabad, with no real power or influence. The old Bengali aristocracy and military class were swept away. All power was now concentrated in the hands of the British administration in Calcutta. The city of Calcutta, once just a trading post, grew into a massive metropolis, the capital of British India. It became the second city of the British Empire, a symbol of British power built on the ruins of Bengali sovereignty. For the people of Bengal, the conquest brought about a profound sense of loss. Their political independence was gone, their economy was shattered, and their social structures were upended. The wealth that had once stayed within Bengal, funding its courts, its armies, and its culture, was now being siphoned off to Britain. This process, known as the drain of wealth, impoverished Bengal and funded Britain's Industrial Revolution. The Anglo Bengal Wars were not just a military conquest, they were the beginning of a colonial relationship that would subordinate India's economy and society to the interests of the British Empire for the next 190 years. The Anglo Bengal Wars, fought between the 1750s and 1760s, may seem like distant history, but their impact is still felt today. These conflicts were the crucial first step in the British conquest of India. They were not just local skirmishes. They were the point where a European trading company transformed into an imperial power. The victory at Plassey gave the British a foothold, but it was the decisive win at Buxar that cemented their control. By gaining the Diwani of Bengal, the East India Company acquired the financial resources to build a massive army and expand its territory, eventually conquering almost the entire subcontinent. The road to the British Raj began on the battlefields of Bengal. The economic consequences of these wars were profound and long-lasting. The deindustrialization of Bengal, once a global manufacturing powerhouse, is a key part of this story. The destruction of its textile industry and the imposition of a colonial agricultural system created a legacy of poverty and dependency. The drain of wealth from Bengal to Britain is a topic that historians and economists still debate, but it undeniably helped fuel Britain's rise as a global industrial power while contributing to the decline of one of Asia's most prosperous regions. Understanding these wars is essential to understanding the complex economic history of both Britain and India. These events also left a deep psychological and cultural mark. For Indians, the story of the Anglo-Bengal Wars is often a story of betrayal, epitomized by figures like Mir Jafar, whose name became synonymous with traitor. It represents the loss of sovereignty and the beginning of a long and often painful period of colonial rule. For the British, it was the start of their imperial adventure in India, a source of immense wealth and power that shaped their national identity for centuries. The events in Bengal created narratives of British superiority and Indian weakness that were used to justify colonial rule for nearly 2 centuries. Today, as we look back, the Anglo-Bengal Wars serve as a powerful lesson in world history. They show how a commercial entity, driven by profit, can become a political and military force capable of toppling kingdoms. They highlight the devastating human cost of colonialism, seen most starkly in the tragedy of the Bengal famine. Studying these wars helps us understand the roots of modern global inequality and the complex, often difficult relationship between the West and the post-colonial world. The story of Siraj-ud-Dowlah, Robert Clive, and the battles of Plassey and Buxar is not just Indian history or British history. It is a crucial chapter in the history of the modern world.